Well, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this event. My name is Dan Smith. I'm director of SIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And we're here this afternoon to be discussing the themes in this new book, fresh off the press, The New Arctic Governance, a multi-authored book edited by Neil Melvin, who's sitting here with us, and Linda Jacobson, who's not. And a couple of other chapter authors are here as well. Katerina Klimenko, who's a researcher at SIPRI, and Andrzej Zagorski, who's head of department in IMIMO, the very well-known, very well-reputed Security and Foreign Policy Studies Institute in Moscow. And Andrzej in particular, welcome here. Welcome to both of you too, and welcome to everybody. The way that we're going to do this is not with any lectures. I really dislike lectures at 5 o'clock on an afternoon, and I always refuse to attend such. And so when we think about how to air issues to an interested and concerned audience, then it has always seemed to me that the best way is to have a conversation and to invite you into that conversation. So I'm going to ask these good people a couple of questions, and we'll have a little round of responses and comments, and then at a certain point I'll open it up for all of you. We're being live streamed, so do be polite, because you're talking to a global audience when you do. And I will remind you again, but if you're thinking of asking a question, please also just tell us who you are as you ask that question. Now look, here's the issue, at least as I see it. We're going to talk about the Arctic, which is a cold place. Last year, 2015, was yet again the hottest year on record. January, 2 months ago, January 2016, is the hottest January ever recorded on worldwide average temperatures. It was 1.15 degrees Celsius warmer than the average of 1950 to 1980. February, last month, was the hottest February ever recorded. It was 1.35 degrees Celsius warmer than the hottest February ever previously recorded in that period. Actually, that breaking the monthly record by 1.35 degrees is itself a record. It's broken the record by a record amount. The average world temperature, as recorded last year, has now increased by 1 degree over pre-industrial times. It's worth 1 degree Celsius. It's worth remembering that the target in the Paris Agreement on climate change reached last December is 1.5 degrees. So we're well on the way towards breaching the internationally agreed target. And in fact, experts say that however well the climate change agreement is implemented, there's 0.6 degrees of Celsius already stacked up in the natural system, just waiting to play out over the next 30 to 40 years. In other words, climate change is a reality. It is happening now, and however well the world gets to grips with this problem, it will happen for the next 30 to 40 years. And that is having, amongst other things, amongst other places where it is having a great impact, an impact in the Arctic. In fact, in the Arctic, global warming is going at about twice the pace that it is in the rest of the world. There's one particularly cold spot which isn't as warming as fast as others, but on average across the Arctic region, it's faster than the average. A while back, as people recognized that this meant that the Arctic area would start to open up for exploitation of natural resources, amongst other changes, because it will also mean big changes for the lives, the conditions of living of people in Greenland. But as people thought about changes in access to natural resources, the thought that this could become a site of competition started to arise. And with that, the idea that it could become an arena of conflict. So I suppose, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 years ago, there were a number of kind of fairly seriously negative scenarios floating around in the minds of researchers and experts and policymakers about what the risks could be. Having said all of which, the good news, as far as I interpret this book, is that this hasn't really come true. Right? So, Neil, could you kick us off with an overview of how it is, and perhaps why it is, that it seems as if cooperation rather than conflict is the order of the day? Because if true, that is enormously encouraging news.
Yeah. No, well, thanks, Dan. I mean, I think you're exactly right. The CIPRI came to this from a traditional CIPRI perspective, is that we began to pick up that many people were talking about the Arctic as a potential zone of conflict, a zero-sum struggle for resources as the Arctic opened up, and maybe even fueling an arms race around that. And there was a lot of rhetoric in the newspapers about that. So we thought it was important to look into this and investigate it. And in fact, well, the story that came out was one that was completely different. It was one, when you spoke to Arctic officials, of a gradually evolving and pragmatic cooperation based on rule of law, international law, cooperation, putting science at the heart of policy making, multilateralism, and also a very interesting story, I think, about how states that often are seen very much as adversaries, United States, Canada, European states and Russia, could actually set aside many of those historical differences and begin to build what we call this new architecture. It wasn't a new architecture that came overnight, but it's one that's developed through this pragmatic cooperation over many years. And I think one of the interesting things is also this, and this is something we can pick up on, is the way that science and knowledge is at the heart of a multilateral process, which I think is in some ways unique. It's really been scientists working together and building a consensus that has driven that kind of policy making.
So, Katja, if I then turn to you straight away, I mean, one of the fears was to do with, I suppose, getting access to resources, the big states, the USA and Russia in particular, moving in with a military build-up. So what have been the approaches in practice, so far as you can interpret, to the security issues, and also to the, Neil used the expression, the zero-sum game. How has that possibility been addressed in the approaches to security policy?
Well, first of all, what already Neil said is just that states realize that there is nothing really to argue in the Arctic about. If we talk about resources, that debate about the possible conflict over resources and territory in the Arctic, that never happened, because most of the resources are in fact in the national territories of the Arctic states. 95% of these resources are in the territories that never going to be disputed. When it comes to the territorial claims, all of them are going to be resolved within the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Of course, we've seen some of the countries putting more attention to the military capabilities in the region, but there it's mostly a question of what for those military capabilities are. Are they for the Arctic, or they are more for strategic purposes, like in case of Russia? Or it's just about the stewardship in the Arctic and sovereignty in the Arctic, and just to show that Arctic states care about the Arctic territories and can patrol and oversee it. So in fact, what has been expected never came true, just because dialogue was there in place.
Well, let me press you a little bit more on that, because experience elsewhere suggests that you don't have to be sure that natural resources are available and accessible in order to start having a dispute about, for example, what are called islands but are actually reefs or just outcrops of rocks in the South China Sea. So the fact that 95% of known natural resources are within national territory might not preclude a national decision maker from thinking, or an ambitious politician from thinking that no, we need to guard against the risk that somebody else will get natural resources. Are you really saying that, as you see it, we are sort of protected from that kind of competition or that kind of conflict in the future?
I would say yes, mostly because most of the states, all of the Arctic states, agreed on the rules of the game, so to say, how to divide them. And whatever is beyond the national territories will be anyway, the territories will be divided according to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This will result in the fact that even if there are some disputes, they will be resolved through dialogue.
So, Andrea, can you take us a little bit broader from the security question then? Because there is a whole array of areas of cooperation or interaction, at least, fishing, search and rescue, simply knowledge, as Neil was saying about that. Can you draw the institutional picture for us a bit of how these things are done and how they're run?
Yes, and we need to recognize it's both formal and informal architecture of this, and probably that's coming back in institutional terms to what Neil started with. I would like to emphasize that understanding that the problems were not that hard in the Arctic came not just of its own. It was a product of a very intensive dialogue, which started in the mid of last decade, and included a lot of things. The announcement of national strategies of Arctic states, in which they made clear what their intentions, what their interests, what their goals were. And it turned out that it was pretty similar if we take all the Arctic states together. It was organizing high-level dialogue formats in different countries, like in Norway, in Russia, in Iceland, elsewhere, where people would meet and talk informally about this stuff. It was beginning to fund research projects, not run simply by either ecologists or geologists, but getting people who were doing security studies and international studies in general looking into the issue. Exactly, we came to the same conclusion which Neil was coming, or Cypri was coming, because I'm running for the Russian Academy of Sciences a program of Arctic international political research, and it was exactly what we finally came to, was understanding that things were not that bad, and it was in legal terms pretty predictable. And even if I go to military assessments, when people were first concerned about eventual claims in the Arctic, they came back and said, okay, Russia has no maritime boundary dispute for the time being with any of the neighbor states, that's fine. And the ownership of resources on the continental shelf is okay. So it was a lot of communication, joint research, conferences, whatever, which was very much helping to diffuse and form some sort of Arctic consensus, as I call this, because there are simple things which are understood in a similar way in different countries. And here also institutional formats were most helpful. And as far for the Arctic, we need to acknowledge that there is not one single institution which is a regional governing body for the Arctic. It's a multiple institutional framework. Of course, among the existing institutions, both regional and global, the Arctic Council is probably the most known one because it got pretty prominent as a multilateral forum for dialogue. It's even not an organization. But also producing some governing documents like agreements, legally binding agreements on search and rescue or preparedness for oil spill, etc. So the Arctic Council brings together 8 countries which have at least part of their territory beyond the polar circle. It is an institution which has limits on what it's doing. It was initially set up in 1996 in order to address issues of environmental protection, sustainable development, increasingly addressing issues of climate change in the Arctic and its impact on the global developments, because Arctic is not only the consumer of the warming, but is also a generator of warming, having secondary effects on the global change. And it was very much science-based, as Neil has supposed, and basically the structure of senior Arctic officials and ministerial meetings once in 2 years was basically summing up the recommendations which were produced by scientists in 6 working groups, and those recommendations which enjoyed consensus, and this is the job for senior Arctic officials to elaborate on the consensus, were approved and became binding in political terms, not in legal terms. So the Arctic Council evolved largely, primarily as an institution where governments talk to each other, not least involving the indigenous population organization, which is a very specific element for the Arctic Council, and which was very helpful to produce common understanding, consensus about simple issues in the Arctic, and also started to produce results in form of agreements to work together on most pressing issues. Security, and this is part of the deliverables of the Arctic Council and the general debate, security is less understood in traditional military terms in the Arctic. Everybody understands it's primarily about the security, environmental security and human security in the Arctic. That's why when we look at the agenda of issues being addressed, it's maritime security, the Polar Code, which has been produced elsewhere outside the Arctic Council in the International Maritime Organization, and it's many other issues. But we need to understand that the Arctic Council cannot do everything. There are global agreements, and it's not only Arctic states which have rights and duties in the Arctic. There is also a large portion of the Arctic Ocean which is not covered by jurisdictions of coastal states. That's why non-Arctic states also have rights and duties here in the region. This is why there are many places where the countries talk about the issues which are relevant for the Arctic. The International Hydrographic Organization has organized an Arctic panel in which countries discuss their findings and harmonize their research and work they are doing on hydrography. The International Maritime Organization is very much in charge of maritime security issues and environmental protection with the Polar Code, which is underway. There are other cases where ad hoc groupings of countries come together, and here you mentioned international fisheries beyond the national jurisdictions in the Arctic, an area in the central Arctic Ocean where no commercial fishing has taken place so far, for understandable reasons, but the ocean opens and the projections would tell us that it may be not impossible in the time to come and nobody knows when. That's why there was an idea to have an international instrument which would prohibit commercial fishing until we decide on the basis of solid scientific research that it is possible. And here we have initially 5 coastal states who came together, discussed the issue, and now have open discussions to 5 more participants outside the Arctic: European Union, China, Korea, Japan, and Japan. So it's a very, very multi-layered structure of institutions, but it's working. And that's the most important stuff.
Well, as I say, that is encouraging. Can we just ensure everybody has a framework? The Arctic Council, 8 states. It's what? The USA, Russia, Canada, Iceland, Denmark, Norway,
Finland.
Sweden, and Finland.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's those 8. And then who are the most involved of other states? You mentioned China, South Korea, and Japan. Who else has, particularly active interests in the area?
So we have many observers within the Arctic Council. We have even more countries who have applied for observer status. So it's many European states like Germany, UK, France, or even Italy recently received this observer status. There are some Asian states, including India, which was also joining the council. We now have Turkey, Greece, a few other countries.
So there's kind of an
it's spreading. It is spreading.
That's why we're in the Mediterranean Museum.
Yes, yeah.
So with all of that, I mean, it's great that things are being so. I'm going to be the bad news bear for a bit here. I mean, what are the points of difference then? Or is it just all running, so easily on such grease tracks that really, that's it, lovely book, thanks a lot. But you're now going to ignore the issue of the Arctic forever because it's a done deal. What are the points of difference that still need attention, that will still need work, that we will still want, political leadership, statesmanship, good working of the senior Arctic officials and so on? Yeah.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd say that at the moment things are still moving quite effectively. As Andrei mentioned, there's under the current American chairmanship, there's ongoing discussion about further progress on some environmental questions, social dimension, even new agreements. There's recently been one on the use of cross-border drones and so on, and plans also to work on this treaty for the sort of the Central Arctic Sea, as it's called, fisheries. But I would say that there are sort of 3 areas, at least I identify, where there could be tensions or even frictions. The first one is that what comes out of our study, I think, is that there's been a remarkable moment in the Arctic, which has been a very positive set of circumstances, underpins this cooperation. And those set of circumstances were a benign international environment for most of the Arctic countries. They demilitarized from the Cold War, where the region was heavily built up. And at the same time, a cake that was expanding. So everyone could agree to actually share a bigger cake, because as the Arctic opened up, so there wasn't a zero sum. In fact, there was a positive sum basis for cooperation. And this is why we have an agreement on rules of the game. So that is, I think, has been a very positive moment. So the question is, will that positive moment carry on forever? As the cake is settled, as the rules of the game are established, will then traditional frictions begin to emerge.
And as the international environment is a little bit less benign. than it
Exactly,
was.
and that would be my second point, is that the Arctic has been this sort of isolated basis for cooperation to some degree. It's been a self-contained region, but not self-contained in the sense it wasn't dependent on other regions, but many of the questions are very much inside the region, and it was left alone for many years. Now we see with the Ukraine sort of situation and the real confrontation between the Euro-Atlantic community and Russia, this is having an impact on Arctic. I mean, cooperation hasn't stopped, but there are some issues. For example, there's been some reluctance to meet at the most senior official level for some meetings. Some of the informal military cooperation has stopped. So that is another area. And the third one, I would say, is this issue about how to incorporate and balance the interests of Arctic states and non-Arctic states. I mean, there's been very important steps, as Andrei mentioned, about bringing in observers, particularly from the Asian countries, Northeast Asia, China, South Korea, and Japan. But there are still questions around that, including this fishing question. And this, I think, is what we see in our book, is that the Arctic states have also worked together in a way also to keep others out. The cooperation is positive, but it's also based on forming a club of interests to establish the rules and then allow others to come in once the rules have been established. Now, will that hold as things go forward? I mean, as resources become scarce, for example, will we then actually have a scenario, as we heard about when we started this project, of people trying to compete for the Arctic resources?
Do you think there is an issue in the informality and the multiplicity of institutions that Andrew was describing is, in a sense, a strength of the process at the moment? But if you think about opening up so that other players can come in, then the multiplicity and the informality means that some of the rules aren't actually explicit, right? You're dealing with institutions in an informal sense, where the issue is rather norms, assumptions, and those assumptions build up over time. They can be tested and they're reliable, but then you get the impact of the outsiders, and they don't buy into those norms, or they're not clear about what the norms are. Do you think there's a potential issue there? In other words, is there a need for at some point in the coming few years, for a greater formalization?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. The chapter in the book by Alison Bales, I think, is very interesting. She describes this as a messy governance, but not necessarily inefficient governance. Actually, she sees a strength precisely in this diversity and informality.
She's a retired British diplomat, so she believes in the value of muddling through.
Yeah, exactly. No big ideologies.
Yes.
But I would say one of the strengths beyond that is this actual commitment to science-based policy making, because that is also a way of bringing in everybody and trying to get them to work together on a common understanding. And so that has also been extended so that the permanent observers also have to be part of the working groups. They can't sort of free ride in that. They have to invest in Arctic science and move forward on that basis. And I think it was interesting, there was recently a kind of, you may have seen it on the TV, this bromance between Obama and Trudeau, where Trudeau from Canada came to visit the White House, and they made a statement about climate change, but it also included a section on the Arctic where Canada and the US were going to work together. But the process that's leading that is cooperative science, including the knowledge of indigenous communities. So it's also sort of traditional science, but also local knowledge as a way of participating. So I think that's a kind of interesting model that may also have an impact somewhere else.
Interesting,
perhaps.
because the climate change agenda has been set remarkably on the terms of scientific knowledge as well. Yeah. There seem to me to be two things as I'm listening to the three of you, which I want to pick out just a little bit more. And one is exactly that, the role of science. And the other one is the role of, whether it's common and shared interests or common and shared assumptions about how to go about working for those interests. And Andrei mentioned, Katja, earlier on, that it's not sort of traditional military security or competitive security. It's more a notion of human security or environmental security. And I guess the first thing is, if you think of the Arctic Council members, I'm not surprised to find some of them being very comfortable with concepts and approaches like human security and environmental security. But I am surprised about a couple of them. So are these concepts sort of absorbed, understood uniformly across the 8 member states of the Arctic Council?
Well, I would say that all of the Arctic states have their own approaches to security. There are some understanding, I would say shared understanding. First of all, climate change. Each and every of the Arctic states understands the role of the climate change in the Arctic and the new security challenges that it's bringing with it. And here, I would say it's a solid basis for cooperation between them on security issues. Maritime security is also sort of understood in the same way, at least understood in a way that states need cooperation on search and rescue and prevention of oil spills. And here we see that within the Arctic Council we have 2 legally binding agreements on those 2 issues. So there are shared issues. Human security, I would say it's mentioned by each and every state in their Arctic strategies to a certain degree. Sometimes it's not mentioned openly, but they say about security of people living there, which is human security.
Yeah.
Yes, I would say most a difference in this way is that how to address those issues, and each and every state have different capacities to address, for instance, maritime security. While Russia has a fleet of icebreakers and nuclear icebreakers, and it has a huge capacity to respond to search and rescue problems. US, for instance, doesn't have icebreakers, and their Coast Guard is fighting for a long time to get some capacity to be able to respond to security challenges coming in the region. So there are common issues and there are differences as well, but I would say it's in every region, and it's not the reason for future conflicts.
And from your perspective, Andrei, do you share Katya's understanding of that, her analysis
I
of
would
that?
say, of course, there are different perceptions of environmental and human security, and different countries have subscribed to different understanding of this. But I believe, for instance, we do have differences on the issue of black carbon emissions in the Arctic, or methane emissions, which is a big issue on the agenda of the Arctic Council, but we move ahead on this. But I would tell you that probably for me the most important lesson I learned by looking in the issues is that the work of the Arctic Council, particularly the scientific community in the working groups, produces a huge mutual socialization effect.
Sorry, mutual
Socialization effect, which does
socialization.
not remove all the differences at once, but which helps developing a common approach and common understanding to what are the real issues and what are the ways to approach them. And I will give you just one example. There are many of this. A couple of years ago, I learned about a project because I got interested in the integrated ecosystem-based approach to the management of maritime areas. And I learned about a project which was run between Russia and Norway. Norway was pioneering this in the Barents Sea, establishing its first integrated plan in 2006. And both countries worked together on developing a parallel plan for the Russian part of the Barents Sea, to have the 2 plans merging and going ahead. And I was told that according to the plan, the proposal for the Russian government was supposed to be submitted at the end of 2015. Earlier in this year, I was asked to evaluate the proposal made for the Russian government to develop establishing an integrated ecosystem-based plan for managing the Russian part of the Barents Sea. So with all the differences we have over Ukraine, this work was going on ahead, and we are back well on the track. It will take time as to develop other differences among every country on many instances, but it will take us time. But working together is exactly the way of removing differences and harmonizing approaches and policies.
And is this dialogue sort of going on in a sense below the surface, or does it get up to the political level and still survive there?
It's both. It's both. It's very much both. It takes political will to promote cooperation, and this allows people at the working level to elaborate on ideas and come up with plans. And often people are simply tasked by doing this stuff. The whole development of the integrated scheme for the Russian part of the Barents Sea was tasked by the president of the Russian Federation.
Right.
And just people are implementing this, and this goes ahead. So again, communication and dialogue at all levels are most helpful to producing synergies, because people at the political level who are willing to cooperate, they always need ideas. And this produces the movement of ideas and proposals between all levels.
Neil, were you going to?
No, I mean, I've been obviously looking ahead to some degree about, I think the question you asked about how to manage issues in the future. And one thing that I wanted to ask Andre a bit about is, I mean, Russia has a very clear perception of the Arctic as Russia's future in a way. It's its future resource base. What we see in this statement by Prime Minister Trudeau and President Obama is a different vision of the Arctic. It's an Arctic as an environmental sort of preserve, possibly even with a ban on oil and gas exploration. Now, those two visions will have difficulty coexisting, and I'm wondering what scope is there in Russia to take on board that kind of vision, given that it seems that the main drivers of Russian interests are precisely in resource exploitation.
Yes, that's different visions, although both in the US and Canada it's not about total ban, but simply about establishing such tough conditions for, if you are expected to drill 2 vessels in parallel, during a very short season, it makes it almost impossible. And many companies got very much disappointed in doing so. The standards are different. But again, Russia is very much dependent on international cooperation in the Arctic in order to optimize the way to get to those resources. Let alone the whole question of to what extent the resources on the Arctic shelf are marketable, not only at the current oil price, but even at much higher prices. It's a big dispute. But exactly because these issues have been brought on the international agenda, both within the Arctic Council, within other places like Barents Euro-Arctic region, and bilaterally with Norway, with other countries, there have been many other environmental cooperation projects. There are several very effectively working international ecological organizations. I would mention WWF in particular, which does have impact. And the intent to get to the resources of the Arctic was very much helpful to put on the agenda of the Russian government also environmental issues. Looking forward to the ratification of several international instruments which address issues of environmental pollution in transborder contexts and many others, applying in the Russian legislation such standards like using the best available technology and many others. So the wish on the Russian side to work on the resources and the need to work together with other countries and companies has produced a very strong momentum in order to make this possible, to incorporate the best available practices and norms and instruments into the Russian legislation. The practice is, of course, often different, but this is a work in progress in general. So my point would be the way we do it in international cooperation and addressing those issues in frameworks like Arctic Council have been most helpful in order here also to achieve a harmonization of standards for environmental protection.
Okay, and before I bring the audience in and ask for people for their comments and their questions, one more thing, if any of you have thoughts on this, is, I mean, to what extent does the Arctic feature in the domestic politics of the Arctic states? Sweden is an Arctic state. Is it a high-profile issue here? Russia, of course, the US, I mean, as you say, a nice meeting between the leaders of Canada and the US. But how big an issue do you see the issues being in domestic politics of any one of the major countries?
Yeah. Well, I think it varies a lot, I would say. I mean, we were here, of course, when Sweden was in the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. And I would say there was a certain waking up that Sweden was an Arctic country, I observed in that period, and even a slight alarm that they had to have an Arctic strategy in rather short time frame, which of course they did develop. And I think this is perhaps also one of the positive things about the cooperation that Andre has been talking about. You see that one of the priorities of the US government actually is to promote an understanding of the United States as an Arctic country. And the fact that Obama traveled to the Arctic, the first US president to do that, has had an impact. I mean, and of course there are some important issues, not least to persuade Congress that the United States should become part of the UNCLOS process. And of course,
the Convention on
exactly,
the Sea.
Which is a sort of the foundation for the territorial delimitation in the Arctic, a keystone of this sort of Arctic spirit of cooperation that we've been highlighting. For other countries, I would say the Arctic has much more of a part of their national identity. You can see this with Canada, for example, which sees itself very much as an Arctic country and Canadians as Arctic people, even though, of course, very few Canadians actually live in the Arctic. It's more a kind of almost like a frontier mentality, and of course, different governments have made different commitments. So, of course, it's those national identities play out in different ways, and even different governments. We see quite a switch in tone on the Arctic issue in Canada between the Harper government and the Trudeau government, for example.
And is there an issue of speaking to an international audience with one voice and a national audience with another?
Yes, sure. I would say in Russia, very often when Russian government officials speak to domestic audience, especially to, for instance, defense-related audiences, it's all about let's increase our military capabilities in the region. We need to defend our Northern Sea route. When we see Russian officials at international conferences, it's all about cooperation. We should cooperate. We should work together. So the tone is different very often. And that's sort of natural, because when you appeal to a national audience, you need to raise the awareness that Arctic is important. When you appeal to, for instance, within defense debates, if defense-related people take the message to their officials that Arctic is important, we need to defend it, then they will get more money from the budget. And that's sort of...
Is there open discussion of a threat against which there's need to defend?
No, it's always vague. There are new security challenges building up in the Arctic region. That was Shoigu's statement a couple of months ago.
And Andrei, do you have a comment on that?
The Arctic identity in Russia is also vague enough. I'll give you a few examples. About 2/3 of the Russian territory lies in the area of permafrost. 2/3. This is one of the understanding of the Arctic. Russian government has a long time and many disputes to figure out and establish in administrative terms what are the borders of the Russian Arctic zone. It took several years to negotiate with different parts of the Russian Federation. We now have a border which is much thinner than it used to be understood, everything which is north of the polar circle. There is a strong community of people in Russia who have been engaged in this or that way in Arctic or polar studies, expeditions, whatever else. They come together every year in St. Petersburg, and it's a very, very different sort of people who have their own feeling of what the Arctic is about and what their lives in the Arctic have been. So it's different identities. It has been high on the political agenda. Yes, exactly, because everybody believed and still does that Arctic is pretty rich in energy resources and other resources as well. Just to give you one example, the widely defined Arctic region in Russia represents 1% of the population of the Russian Federation. It generates 22% of the Russian exports, and Russia lives on the exports primarily. Over 80% of natural gas comes from the northern parts of the country, and increasing the volume of oil produced in Russia. So it's different identities, different understanding, and Katya has rightly told, yes, of course there is a logic. If there is a wealth outside there, we need to defend it.
Right. Okay, let me open it out to the audience. If you please come up with a question or a comment and say who you are as you do. There's one right there, please, sir.
Hello, my name is Dr. Damien de Georges. I'm a Reykjavik-based consultant working on Arctic affairs. You talked at some point about the difficulty for American and Russian interests to coexist in the Arctic. How do you see the cohabitation between American and Chinese interests in the region? Thank you.
US and China. Yeah. Neil, do you want to take that's a big enough question to have a stab at all by itself.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that, at least at this moment, I don't think there's a big contradiction. I mean, the Chinese are an emerging presence in the Arctic, certainly. They have two main interests. One is the Northern Sea route, and the other one is, I would say, the energy resources, particularly those in the Russian Federation. And so China has 20% of the Yamal gas production, the liquid liquid natural gas, which is then going to be shipped to Chinese markets. There's been a lot of, I think, speculation about Chinese investments in Greenland and Iceland, I think really at the height of this kind of geopolitics of resources issue. I have heard some people suggest that the return of the US military presence to Iceland is not simply about the growing concerns of Russian military forces operating from Arctic bases, but also of the possibility of Chinese military forces of Chinese influence coming close to the American border on the Atlantic side. I think that's rather fanciful at the moment. I mean, I think that at this stage there's very little evidence to do that. And I think particularly in a global resource market where in fact it's rather hard to see much of a basis for significant development of Arctic resources when oil is so low, the price is so low. I mean Arctic oil and gas, well, Arctic oil is probably around $100 would be required for it to be break even. So at present, I don't see such a scenario.
Just quickly on the Northern Sea route, because I mean, I know years back, the thought was that the world has been locked at the top, and so you have to look at the world as something that you go around. But if the Arctic ice melts and the Northern Sea route opens up, you can now look at the world in a completely different way, and you can zip across the top, just as it revolutionized air travel when planes had the long enough range to go like that. So it could revolutionize transport. But essentially, that doesn't look to be on at the moment, does it, Katja?
No, not really. Northern Sea route is still pretty much a domestic route for Russia. It's we can see the statistics for the last couple of years. First, there was a bit of an interest when Russia sort of opened up its Arctic and started talking about international transit. But that route is really still difficult to take. It's still difficult, navigational conditions, still not enough of good infrastructure to go through. And yes, some of the states tried, some of the companies tried experimental transits through the Northern Sea route. But now we can see that this interest fell down.
Right.
So you cannot use this route all year round. So it's 3 to 4 months and only with icebreakers. You have to.
So when you can use it, you still need the ice breaking technology.
In most of the times, yes. Yeah. And Russia doesn't really allow low ice class ships to go without Russian icebreakers. You cannot bring your own icebreaker. So it's really not the same conditions as it would be in the Suez Canal route or any other shipping routes. So it's a way to go there. And then one more thing, it's geographical conditions. It's still a very shallow waters, right. And big container ships cannot really go through it.
I mean, at the moment, it is said that on the big routes, coming from to East Asia, from East Asia through the Indian Ocean to the Gulf, from the Gulf down, and so on, through the Suez Canal, it's said that at any point you can always see at least one ship ahead of you and one ship behind, and the Northern Sea route is.
It's 70 transfers within the whole year.
Right. Yeah. Sorry.
Really.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are many ships there, and every year the administration of the Northern Sea route issues over 700 permissions to sail there. But most of this is not international transit shipping.
Right.
Last year, I believe it was something like 18 transit passages, and only 6 of them international, or something like this. It goes down. The main advertisement point for the Northern Sea route is, of course, to say that the distance is shorter. You have shorter time between at least Northern Europe and China, or Atlantic and Pacific, would be the shortest route. You can save on the fuel, etc. And this is really so if you have good weather, etc. The problems here are very different, of different sorts. I haven't seen any forecasts until the end of this century which would forecast that the multi-year ice, that the seasonal ice will disappear totally in the Arctic. Multi-year ice, yes, but it will be replaced by seasonal ice in winter, and the summer is going to remain pretty short. It may extend a little bit the navigation season, but still it will be within 3 to 4 months maximum by the mid of current century. This means any navigation along the Northern Sea route will remain seasonal. It will require special ships. And you don't need to look at the Russian requirements, look at the Polar Code. What requirements, both environmental and security, safety requirements, are in there. So every ship owner would have to take a decision whether to construct a special ship, which would be much more expensive to operate outside the season, outside the Northern Sea route, etc. And the whole infrastructure, there is not a single deep sea port where you can hide in case of bad weather. Communication, hydrography, cartography is almost lacking in there. It's a lot of things which need to be invested in and be developed in order to make it possible. So the point is, and by everyone who is seriously dealing with the issue does not proceed on the basis that the Northern Sea route will become a regular international route anytime soon. Probably sometime in the future, if the ice disappears
Far
fully.
off future.
Maybe I could just add one thing to that, of course, and that's that. I mean, well, there's no doubt that some of the Northeast Asian countries have an interest, particularly in energy, and we'd like to see some transit there. But I mean, China is also investing a huge amount of money in this One Road, One Belt project, which is a land-based transport system. So the Northern Sea route has to not just have its own conditions right, but has to compete in a global market for transport, as do Arctic resources. And so it can't be seen on its own merits. It has to actually be competitive globally, and it's very hard to see that as a sort of a significant sea route in that context, I think.
Okay. Another question? Right here.
My name is Karen van Stegeren. I'm the Deputy Head of Mission of the Netherlands. The Netherlands is an observer country at the Arctic Council, as most of you will know. And in that capacity, I've been able to sit in a couple of the Arctic Council meetings during the Swedish presidency. I was very pleasantly surprised to see what happened there. I saw it as a kind of track 2 approach, what you see in international diplomacy. And my question is about the approach. You're all experts on conflict management and resolution, and it seems to me that you've answered the title of this seminar with a yes. And my question then is, would the way countries work together as far as the Arctic is concerned be a model to solve other conflicts in the world? Could we adopt it elsewhere?
I recall one of my colleagues quoting someone who was saying, if Russia and the West will not be able to cooperate in the Arctic, they will be unable to cooperate anywhere. And this is probably indeed true. And it may not be the model as such, because it's a very, very specific area with a very specific set of different rights and obligations of the countries, etc. But it is certainly an area which is extremely cooperative, including in the times of tension. This is something which can help us to overcome the tensionous times. So if we produce more cooperative experiences in the Arctic, and we do so, this can help to accumulate the positive experiences in general in the relationship and help to alleviate many other conflicts. Almost everything in the Arctic, not everything, but almost everything is low-hanging fruit. If we learn to pick it together, we can learn more for other areas as well.
If you let me, one more thing is just that Arctic Council, the meetings of the Arctic Council have often served as a platform to discuss something else, very controversial issues. Remember that at one of the ministerial meetings, John Kerry and Lavrov sit down and discuss Syria. So that was about the Arctic. The meeting was about the Arctic, but still it was used as a sidelines for something else. So I think even if it's not a model, as Andrei have just mentioned, for something else, it will be a platform to probably restart the dialogue between Russia and the West in the future, or when there is some other controversial issues, to use it as a platform to discuss it.
I mean, if I can add to that also, I mean, I think one thing that is important, which you've already mentioned, I think is actually very close to the CIPRI spirit as well, actually, which is it's a kind of decision-making that is based upon establishing the facts. And that's what sort of worked, is get everyone on board on what the sort of shared facts are, which then also establishes where you disagree, and then you can move forward pragmatically. And this is what I think the Arctic Council has done, and other sort of formal and informal institutions, and to begin a process on that basis that takes one small step after another. So, like Andre said, I think you can't solve all problems in the world on that model, but there are some things, I think, where you could look at particular issues in international security where perhaps that kind of approach, expert-led initially, trying to build up to the political level, could be something that would be positive.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think there's also a way in which you can just sort of edge off the strictly the security and the conflict issues, and think more about resolving problems or addressing issues that, if left unaddressed, could indeed feed through into political instability or disagreement or contention or dispute at some future stage. And from that point of view, I think that the parallels between the Arctic Council taking a science-based approach to policy and the approach to climate change, and how that could be applied also to other issues of environmental stability. I mean, our whole relationship to nature is coming into question in this era in a way that it has not done at any point during human history. There is a possibility that what humans are doing, this is the era of the Anthropocene, there is a possibility that what humans are doing and have been doing leads to major extinctions. And that's been an ongoing discussion. Letting that happen could be enormously destabilizing for human communities, societies all over the world. Addressing those problems, even if we cannot prevent those extinctions, we work out ways of addressing those issues by working together on the basis of science and fact. That seems to me that there's something that's worth exploring there in the bigger picture, where actually it's not that the Arctic Council could be a model for how you resolve conflicts in the Middle East, but that spirit of cooperation and of multiple overlapping institutions, formal and informal, is a surprisingly rich one to draw on for thinking about other issues elsewhere. Those are two big questions. Another one. There's one here. Microphone's coming.
Far from the Egyptian embassy, it's far away from the Arctic region.
Part of the wider Arctic.
So I wonder, with the current level of global warming, in case of reaching like a mechanism for dispute settlements and agreement and cooperation, when can we expect the international navigation corridor in the north to be established, the international navigation corridor? Do you have like an expectations evaluation for like to compete with other navigation corridors?
I think it's quite difficult to say. I think, as Andre mentioned, it's not going to be in the near future. I mean, there'll probably be a gradual rise in transit traffic and also a rise in sort of internal Russian traffic. But I mean, I guess, I don't know, you probably know the figures better than I do, Andre, but 2050 is probably the earliest we could think of as
Yes, I was looking at projections until 2035, slightly beyond. Of course, at this horizon, there is not going to occur as an international navigation route. But let me raise a different point, because often, in Russia at least, the development of the Northern Sea Route is discussed against the background of whether or not Northern Sea Route can make competition to Suez. It's at least in the foreseeable time, at least until the end probably of this century, it's impossible for a very simple reason that for the Arctic routes you need special ships, ice strengthened with special requirements for the power base, special materials for the temperatures, outside temperatures, etc. So it's impossible simply to take a Suez Max from the Suez Canal and let it go through the Northern Sea route. It will be impossible. You need special ships, and I know a few. It's basically a job for a few specialized shipping companies who engage in mainly bulk cargo shipping. Who really do construct and who have specialized niches for the transportation of ore or something like this grain, etc., in bulkers between Northern Europe and China. It's having up to 10 ice-strengthened carriers, bulker carriers, and to do this. So it's not the time at the horizon to take Suez Maxes from Suez to the Northern Sea route. Yes, they would not fit into the channels because channels are shallow enough and not wide enough, but eventually, yes, there is a higher altitude route above the islands. It has been proven by Russian ship owners that it is available for shipping. The maximum ships they were putting on this were 100,000 tons. The depth is okay, and of course the ice is a problem. And just don't forget, if the ice melts away, at least for the season, the navigation conditions are not getting better, they're getting worse. Because the less ice, the more the possibility of an incident with an iceberg. The fewer ice you have, the more icebergs you have floating there in the sea. If you look at the Arctic storms, and this is ice storms, with the height of the waves up to 12 and 15 meters high, and have not a single deep sea port in which you can hide from this. So it's not a very hospitable situation. It's Arctic winter. In the summer, it's fog. So in both seasons, it's primarily zero visibility on the sea. It's a very, very inhospitable region, and it's not going to change much in the future.
I think that's actually an really important point to understand. The way in which, I mean, one thinks of the melting of the ice. You think, okay, the ice will be gone. But no, it'll be there, but in a different shape and a different form, and very often a more dangerous one, or at least as dangerous.
Ice-free in the Arctic means no more than 15% ice.
Yeah.
But it can be up to 15% ice.
All terms are relative.
Yeah.
Another question. Yeah, it's allowed. Say who you are and your connection to the book, and we'll.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, just to throw in another sort of element into the discussion of the Northern Sea route, and it's something I haven't thought about before, but does the Northern Sea route have to be profitable?
Has to be.
Profitable. I mean, are there other things that you can throw in as national prestige and so on? Does it have to be profitable to be developed?
It's basically a question, profitable to whom? And profitable in which way? I believe, I'm often asking the question, okay, we build nuclear-powered icebreakers. Why don't other nations do so? Are they stupid or what? It's not profitable. It's not economically viable. So the big question is, why does Russia build nuclear-powered icebreakers? Are we stupid? Or is there a different rationale? And here again, in the 1970s, the Soviet Union went ahead in constructing nuclear-powered icebreakers for one single reason. And that was to get the production of the Norilsk nickel to Russia, other places, and other markets, because there was simply no other way of transporting this stuff, because of the permanent frost and lack of any infrastructure. So a single way to get the stuff out was by marine shipping, and this was a single reason for the Soviet Union to make the year-round navigation with the help of nuclear icebreakers possible in the Kara Sea, not elsewhere in the north. So again, today, in my understanding, the single reason for Russia to construct 3 new nuclear power icebreakers is to allow for marine shipping of the liquefied natural gas and oil production from the Yamal Peninsula area. That's a single reason for. And if I look at the volume of the contracts by Atomflot, it's exactly the volumes and the capacity they are supposed to obtain. So it may be different rationales, and of course it is profitable for the port of Sabeta, which is under construction, because they will have something like 20 million tons traffic there. It will be profitable for the shipping companies who will be engaged. it will be profitable for the Atomflot, which runs the atomic icebreakers. It's not profitable for the state because the state subsidizes the whole operation. But it's a single way to get stuff shipped out from where it is produced.
Just let me
Yeah, go
add on
ahead.
this. It's never been a question of making money out of the Northern Sea route. It's really, as a shipping route, like there was some time a discussion and questions I got like, why do Russians don't charge for ships passing by? They're charging for the icebreaker support, but not really for passing by. So it has never really been a point to establish this kind of business for the Northern Sea route. It's also, Andrei mentioned, I guess, there before, but it's also about the communities leaving along the Northern Sea route that cannot be reached anyway by through water. So in the Soviet Union and now, it's still not about profit, but about getting the food and fuel to the communities living there. So it has never been profitable, and it will not be profitable in the future.
And they cannot be reached by any way in the winter, except for by air. So everything needs to be done in the summer.
Right here. Wait for the mic. Thanks.
Lahiro from Research on European Security. A couple of years ago, first I would like to thank you all for very interesting new information for me and new insights that I didn't have. Well, a few years ago there were a lot in the news about claims to the Arctic, to the North Pole. Denmark, Russia, and several other countries, at the same time as they said that they would respect the United Nations as the ruler of the game. We don't hear much about that now. Why is that so? Is this no issue now, or what is happening?
We
do hear quite a lot. This is one of the issues which raises a lot of emotions around the Arctic Circle. We have had some new developments in this area because in December 2013, Denmark had introduced its claim for Greenland, which was a surprise for many, not only in Russia, but even when I went through Michael Byers' most recent book on the international law in the Arctic, even he would not expect Denmark to claim the whole length of the Lomonosov Ridge. It was a big surprise for many. It was raising emotions. Russia introduced its renewed claim in August last year, also slightly correcting its previous submission. But the important thing here is that in 2008, all coastal states which can claim continental shelf, extended continental shelf in the Arctic, have agreed that they will all adhere strictly to the provisions of the UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, based on Article 76, which means they all will submit their claims to the Commission on the limits of the continental shelf and will seek recommendations by the Commission, and then we'll see where we are on this. Secondly, in 2014, particular overlaps are likely to occur between Russia and Greenland, Russia and Canada. There will be no problem between Russia and the US because we do have our delineation line agreed in 1990 agreement. And there are a few minor issues between Norway and Greenland and Norway and Iceland, which have to be cleared. In this, well, Norway has settled this in 2006, saying, okay, you claim your part of the shelf, and when you get recommendations from the Commission, we will sit down and negotiate how we delineate this stuff. We had a similar agreement between Russia and Denmark and Russia and Canada, fixed by notes exchange in 2014, saying we will not object the consideration of the claims. We don't object issuing recommendations by the Commission without prejudice to the rights of other countries. And once all submissions have been considered, recommendations issued, provided overlap occurs, we sit down and we talk about how we delineate this, which basically means we all are within the procedure established by the UNCLOS. I believe last year the most important thing was that upon the Danish submission and then upon the Russian submission, every single country acted exactly in the agreed way. Every single country was sending a note to the Commission saying we don't mind considering the claim, we don't mind issuing recommendations without prejudice to our rights, which may arise from the consideration of our claim, etc. So everybody was signaling very clearly, yes, we are within the established procedure, and this was, of course, alleviating any tensions. The whole stuff is going to take a very, very long time. The Commission considers submissions one by one as they have been submitted. The Danish claim, I believe, is number 78 or something like this. And in 15 years of its existence, the Commission has issued recommendations on 22 claims. So it will take us another 10, 15 years until the Commission begins considering the Danish claim. Canada has not yet even submitted one for the North. It takes more time for Canada. The US has yet to ratify UNCLOS, and then it will have 10 years from the ratification moment to submitting its claim. So it will take us decades. And as long as submissions are in the Commission, as long as they have not been considered, no recommendations issued, every possible option remains open. And there are many options on how this issue can look like at the end of the day. It may happen that we have an overlap in claims confirmed by the Commission. In that case, we'll have to sit down and talk about this, which may take us more decades, because no one expects any resources to be in this part of the Arctic Ocean, and this means no resources, no incentive, simply the prestige issue, and you may spend a lot of time in discussing the issue. It may well happen that there is no overlap. There are some specificities which need to be proven by scientists. I'm not a geologist myself, I cannot look at the evidence, but it well still may happen that between the Greenlandic and Canadian extended continental shelf and the Russian one, there are still some 500 miles of open ocean without any overlap. Everything is open so far. The claims by themselves are not yet the final stage. The final stage will be when the Commission has discussed it. So we are in the pipeline. So for me, the most important part here is not the claims. And the claims, of course, make people emotional. But the most important part for me is that we show clearly to each other that we are predictably within the procedure which we have agreed upon. And this is what is really happening.
Sounds like the process moves at glacial speed.
Can I just add on the whole debate about the North Pole? I would say it was a very political issue in many countries. As in Denmark, for instance, one of the Danish politicians said not a single Danish government would dare to submit a claim without claiming a North Pole because it was such a big thing at home. So it wasn't really because somebody wanted North Pole or because there is something there, but because just to show the domestic audiences that we claim it, it's important. And then all of this debate started in 2007 when Russia planted the flag. And that was also not for international audience, it was for domestic audience to show that Russia is doing research there, and basically they didn't really expect such a fuss around this. So it was a snowballing effect of the media and then some researchers and stuff. So, but now when there is no really, as Andrei explained, there is a procedure, nobody really wants to talk about it. That's why it's never there anymore.
Yeah, let me say, it's still a lot of uncertainties in this, if you look at the details of the claims. Because certainly Greenland is the closest to the North Pole. And if the whole Lomonosov Reach is considered by the Commission as a continental continuation, they will get it. But the Lomonosov Reach is not one. There are many rifts in this, on both sides of the pole. So it's going to be very much depending on the Commission how it qualifies at the end of the day. Does it accept the whole reach as continental shelf, or does it say, okay, here it's too deep interruption, so up to now, up to here, and no longer. So anything is yet open. That is for geologists, and this is a good thing of this, because it depoliticizes the whole process. It is again science-based approach. And this was a single possibility for people who were writing UNCLOS to agree on the procedure, because the trick is that if you go through the UNCLOS procedure, it gives you the maximum possible legal certainty. Because if you establish the outer limits of your continental shelf on the basis of the recommendations of the Commission, these limits are considered final and binding for every single state. Malaysia, or South Africa, whoever else, will not be able to claim it illegal because it has been established within the procedure. Which means it doesn't give a say to any countries which are not involved. And the single reason for them to agree to the procedure, that they would accept it, was to say, okay, let's depoliticize the whole process. We would be able to accept a scientific judgment, not a political one. And this was behind the whole arrangement reached in negotiating UNCLOS.
Take another question. There is one. Please, you're welcome. Okay, coming to the end of the discussion. Now, it so happens very fortuitously that the Arctic Council is meeting in Fairbanks, Alaska, over the next 2 days. So my final question to each of you is, well, what would your advice be? What are your bullet points for the people as they go into the Arctic Council? We'll do it in the same order as we began. So we'll begin with you, Neil.
Yeah, well, actually, one issue which hasn't come much, I thought it would be much more, is this sort of security dimension and the whole debate, which we covered a little bit, or quite extensively, I guess, in CIPRI not so long ago, the alleged militarization of the Arctic, particularly on the Russian side. And I think as another CIPRI publication by Katerina highlights, I mean, there are some serious issues there, and it's more to do with this spilling in of security problems from other areas into the Arctic. So I think one issue that the Arctic, maybe not exactly the Arctic Council, but the Arctic states need to deal with is how to address these hard security issues which have taken on a new significance in the region as a result of the Ukraine crisis. And I mean, there's a number of dimensions to that. One is of the fact that Russian nuclear strategic forces in the Arctic now have a better protection than they used to have, but that of course has an impact on the neighboring states, particularly in our neighborhood here. Another one is that the Arctic bases of Russia now have this multiple function. They could be about policing the Arctic, they could also be about flying bombers from the Arctic bases to almost anywhere in the globe. So I think the issue of how to introduce a better transparency and understanding, shared understanding, which is broken down to some degree in the OSCE and other contexts into this region. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've had a NATO exercise in Norway, Cold Response. Obviously a response to Ukraine. British forces training American forces in Arctic warfare. So this, I think, is a warning sign that we maybe in the Arctic states, in the Council or somewhere else, I think it would be good to look at this issue.
Need to discuss that. Katarina?
I have a very short phrase, keep talking. To the Arctic states, to all of them, the fact that Arctic has been such a successful case of cooperation, it's extremely important to continue it and keep talking on different things. Now we have stopped talking about security, hard security issues, all the possible platforms where this has been discussed has been suspended, and I think that it's extremely important to reopen them and to address these issues and then also build confidence between different Arctic states.
Okay, and Andrew?
Well, senior Arctic officials have a long agenda. They have a set agenda of issues which they need. There are many important issues there. We also need to be aware that one area which the Arctic Council is prohibited to address is security, or traditional military security. But still, I do believe that many things can be done also through the Arctic Council in terms of addressing different sort of security issues. And it's important exactly because of the findings we came to in parallel in our studies and CIPRI studies and in a few other places, that there's less of security problems in the Arctic, but much of the securitization debate of the Arctic. So the basic question is, how do we desecuritize the Arctic debate in order to bring things to the proper dimensions? And this is an area in which Arctic Council can still do a great job, because the best way of promoting mutual understanding is working together. And even without dealing with hard security issues, Arctic Council has at least 2 agreements. One is on search and rescue, one is on the oil spill preparedness, and another one is in progress looking at the prevention of oil spills, etc. So there's a huge amount of work which can be done together on the basis of these 2 agreements, because in fact the basic rationale for these 2 agreements was to spell out the protocols of how countries can work together, how they can help each other. There are many things they can do together within this kind of framework, and I believe it was a great idea which was submitted by the US chairmanship of the Arctic Council to hold every 2 years a life exercise within the search and rescue agreement, hosted by each incoming chairmanship, and to have more cooperation exactly in these fields. Coast Guards Forum is going to be very helpful, and in many other fields. Working together and expanding joint programs is, of course, a recipe for continued cooperative approach in the Arctic.
I mean, I think that sometimes the case is that you can make something better by behaving as if it's better. And similarly, you can stop things from deteriorating by behaving as if they're not deteriorating. And I think that's the sort of message that in some ways you're all 3 talking about. There's something that's really quite serious, significant, solid, also quite precious, and worth protecting and keeping going in the work which has been done in the Arctic. You know, I must say that a Peace Research Institute spends a lot of its time, obviously, looking at issues of how conflict comes about, how it escalates, and how it produces a nightmare for people. This is a case where we're actually also researching how peace comes about, how cooperation works, and how it produces something that's fairly worthwhile. So I would like to thank our 3 speakers, Neil Melvin and Katerina Klimenko and Andrzej Zagorski, for enlightening us this evening, and thank you all for coming, and let us thank them and each other in the usual way.